A janitor wiped down the Pentagon's most restricted office, unaware the man asleep in the chair wasn't exhausted at all. Admiral Danny Diggs had commanded fleets, intercepted nuclear codes, and buried more secrets than any one man should, but tonight, he was pretending to rest. What he didn't expect was for her to whisper the same words his wife had spoken 20 years ago, the last words ever recorded from a woman officially listed as deceased in service. Danny hadn't truly slept in decades. He didn't allow himself to. Not after the Edenfall debacle. Now, under the cold hum of fluorescent lights, he sat in full uniform behind a steel desk, posture slumped just enough to sell the illusion. His medals caught the faint glow of the monitors, and his hand dangled over the armrest, deliberate, human, tired. It was a performance he'd rehearsed in war zones and White House briefings alike, the weary man who could be trusted. Through half-lidded eyes, he watched the door's reflection in the polished floor. The Pentagon's midnight wing was silent, but for the drone of ventilation. He was waiting not for sleep, but for truth. Whoever entered this room next would decide whether he'd spent his career serving his country or feeding its ghosts. A soft beep. A keycard. The door slid open with surgical quiet. Rubber soles whispered across tile. The rhythmic squeak of a cleaning cart. Then hesitation. "Sir," a woman's voice, tentative but warm. He stayed still. His pulse, trained, measured, didn't break rhythm. The scent of lemon cleaner drifted through the air, undercut by something gentler, hand soap, faintly floral, cheap. Not the perfume of power. The perfume of survival. She moved carefully, wiping down counters, collecting empty cups. For several minutes, she didn't approach his desk. No theft, no curiosity, only discipline. Then, finally, she stopped beside him. Her voice dropped to a whisper meant for no one. "They never let you rest, do they?" Danny's eyes snapped open a fraction, not enough for her to notice. Because those exact words, had been spoken by Claire Diggs moments before her body disappeared into a sealed, classified coffin 2 decades earlier. The mop handle clattered softly into its bucket. By the time he dared to lift his head, the janitor was gone, and with her, the fragile line between his duty and the dead. He straightened in his chair, every cell awake now. The test was supposed to catch a thief. Instead, it had just unearthed a ghost. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. Danny Diggs sat frozen in his chair long after the janitor had disappeared. The fluorescent lights above him flickered slightly, casting sharp angles across the room as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. His breathing was steady, practiced, but his thoughts stormed. That whisper, 6 words, had cut deeper than any bullet. He hadn't heard them since 2003, since the night Claire Diggs, his wife, vanished into a sealed ops file no one was allowed to speak of. He stood slowly, each movement deliberate, as if shifting too fast would disturb something fragile. The room felt colder now. Not just because of what she'd said, but how she said it softly, gently, like it wasn't meant to be heard at all. It wasn't mimicry. It wasn't coincidence. It was memory, and the kind that should have been buried with a body they never let him see. He crossed his desk and keyed in his personal clearance code, D4N1X, red. A custom interface loaded across his secondary monitor, the real one, hidden behind decoy files and bureaucratic distractions. He typed Karen Townsend into the search bar and watched the system begin to pull up her personnel file. Janitorial contractor. Civilian employee since January. 2 jobs, 1 dependent, clean record. On paper, she was the kind of person security protocol ignored entirely. Basic file in hand, he ran it through a level 2 scan, the kind that bypassed HR protocols and cross-referenced internal servers, financials, and clearance levels. He expected to find a false positive, maybe a stolen badge, maybe a mistagged ID card. What he didn't expect was for her access log to ping red. Not just any red, classified red, the kind that belonged to dormant ghost-level clearances. Underneath the access timestamp was a clearance line that hadn't existed in nearly 2 decades, authorized via Directive X Delta. He leaned back in his chair slowly, eyes locked on the glowing text. That clearance hadn't just expired, he had personally buried it. Directive X Delta was part of a tri-branch program developed post 9/11 for rapid clearance assignment during asymmetric warfare. It had been used to grant temporary access to civilian assets during Black Ops operations. But it was decommissioned in 2007, shuttered, encrypted, then purged. And only 3 people had ever had the authority to revive it. One was dead. One was in prison. The third was sitting right here, staring at the ghost of his own signature. He scanned again, this time digging deeper into Karen's work history. Everything seemed normal: cleaning assignments, routine badge logs, timesheets. But tucked inside the file was an anomaly, an override entry-approved notation, flagged with a zero-date timestamp. Zero date. No origin, no user, no trace. It was as if the system had been told to let her in, and to forget who told it. Diggs reached for the encrypted line hardwired into his office phone. He keyed in a direct frequency, not used in years. It rang 3 times before someone picked up. Osprey, the voice answered. Short, clipped, British. You're not supposed to call this line. Directive X Delta, Diggs said. Somehow, it's still alive. A pause. Then, that's not possible. We burned that program down to the bone. I'm staring at an access log that says otherwise, Diggs said. Civilian. No known clearance. Janitor. Name's Karen Townsend. Another silence. Then, run her DNA. If X Delta tagged her, it'll light up. I was hoping you'd say I was being paranoid, Diggs muttered. That I was just chasing ghosts. If it's X Delta, Osprey said, then ghosts is exactly what you're chasing. And one of them was your wife. The line went dead. Diggs didn't move. He stared at the blank screen for a long time, his jaw set tight. He hadn't said a word about Claire. Hadn't mentioned her name. And yet Osprey had spoken it without hesitation. Ghosts indeed. The next hour was methodical. He pulled Karen's personnel file, scanned it into his encrypted system, and ordered a backtrace on her DNA sample. Every Pentagon employee, even civilian custodial staff, had one on file after the 2012 breach. He loaded her sample into his secure analyzer and cross-referenced it against a hidden registry, Project Perseus, a classified biometric archive created under the umbrella of DARPA's Human Augmentation Initiative. And that's when his hands froze over the keyboard. The results didn't just ping. They matched. 97.3% DNA compatibility with subject, Claire Diggs. It wasn't a false positive. It wasn't a cousin or sister or stolen tissue. Karen Townsend's DNA was a near-perfect match to a woman declared biologically dead in 2003. He stared at the screen, not blinking. The machine shouldn't be wrong. Not this machine. And yet here it was, cold, clinical, mechanical, confirming what he already knew in his gut. Karen wasn't just a janitor. She was connected. And that whisper? It wasn't accidental. It was the echo of a memory she shouldn't have. He tapped into surveillance logs from the last 30 days. Watched her cleaning, moving through restricted zones, showing no interest in the classified material right in front of her. She was routine, consistent, boring, everything an infiltrator never was. But every now and then, he'd catch something in her eyes. A pause. A glance at the stars through the window. A quietness that felt too knowing. Claire used to look like that when she was remembering things she wasn't allowed to say out loud. The screen flickered again. A note had auto-populated into the log beneath her genetic match. Subject, K, classified under Project Edenfall. Access requires Red 9 authorization. His blood went cold. Edenfall. The one word Claire had begged him to never speak again. The last word she'd whispered before being transferred to a facility he was never allowed to visit. The same program whose files were locked behind retinal scan and voice print, his own, as Chief Naval Liaison. He walked to the private console in the far corner of his office, the one embedded into the wall behind a false electrical panel. Keyed in his override. Let the scan complete. Retinal. Voice. Admiral Daniel R. Diggs. Clearance Red 9. Execute unlock. Edenfall Archive 1. The wall opened silently, revealing a small monitor. Data began to pour onto the screen. Operation Edenfall. Initiated. June 2003. Status: dormant. Objective: memory preservation through biological imprinting. Method: clonal sequencing using recovered neurotissue. Result: viable female embryo. Subject tag: K. Surrogate implanted, September 2004. Diggs swallowed. The dates aligned. Subject K had been implanted less than 18 months after Claire's death. He kept reading. Surrogate terminated after delivery. Child rehomed via civilian protective identity construct. No active monitoring. Until now. He stumbled back from the console, legs weak. He didn't remember authorizing this. He remembered briefings, vague medical diagrams, ethical debates muffled under layers of politics and grief. But no one ever told him they'd used her. That Claire's body hadn't just been buried, it had been harvested. And now the result of that experiment was pushing a mop and whispering things no one else could know. There was more. He scrolled. Project Addendum, genetic derivative protocol enacted post-subject viability. Secondary embryo created. Tag A1. Unknown carrier. Unknown monitoring status. Purpose: developmental compatibility testing. His stomach turned. A1. Another subject. Another product of Claire. God help him. Was Karen's son the next phase of the experiment? He closed the console. Sat back in his chair, heart racing. There was no going back now. This wasn't about espionage. This wasn't about leaks or sleeper agents. It was about a woman the government had tried to recreate. A memory brought back in flesh. And a child who should never have existed, unless someone had planned for him to. Diggs looked back toward the door she had exited hours earlier. Karen Townsend. Single mom. Janitor. Civilian. Or so she thought. But he knew better. And now he had to decide what to do with the knowledge no one else in the world had the clearance or the conscience to hold. The morning after the whisper, Admiral Danny Diggs arrived 2 hours before his staff and sat alone in the conference briefing room on sublevel 4. The room was sterile, like most in the Pentagon, lined with secure screens, wall-mounted speakers, and the sharp hum of security sensors. He stared at the manila folder in front of him, its tab marked simply Townsend, K. This was no longer a background check. It was the beginning of a reckoning. He had called Karen in under the guise of a routine contractor audit, something HR did quarterly to justify security renewals and cross-check badge usage. She showed up right on time, in the same brown uniform she always wore, tired but polite, her expression unreadable. She looked every bit like a woman surviving paycheck to paycheck, not a classified genetic artifact buried under 2 decades of lies. Danny gestured to the seat across from him and offered a rehearsed smile. Karen Townsend, thank you for coming in. This won't take long. Karen nodded and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Of course, sir. Is this about the badge scan on Monday? Her voice was calm, direct, almost too composed. He studied her as she sat there, not realizing she was a woman sitting across from her own origin story. Danny gave a small shrug, as if brushing away any suspicion. No red flags, just some internal audits. We like to keep things clean. He started with basic questions: how long she'd worked here, which wings she cleaned, any suspicious activity she might have noticed. She answered like someone who had nothing to hide, clearly, concisely, without hesitation. She didn't fidget, didn't pause, didn't blink too much. But Danny wasn't listening to her answers. He was watching how she answered. Her voice was familiar, not because it was identical to Claire's, but because it felt like hers. Like being spoken to by someone who used to know every corner of his soul. He moved to the pretext he'd prepared. Part of the audit includes evaluating staff memory recall and facial recognition due to past issues with unauthorized tailgating. I'm going to show you a few photos. Just let me know if any of them look familiar. Karen nodded again, unbothered, unaware. Danny turned the monitor to face her and tapped through the first 10 images, generic photos of Pentagon staff, some civilians, some military. Karen responded quickly. No. No. Maybe. No. He hesitated on photo 11. It was Claire, not in uniform, but in civilian clothes, hair tied back, standing on a runway beside an unmarked aircraft. The image had been taken 3 weeks before she died. "This one?" he asked softly. Karen blinked, leaned forward. Her brow furrowed, not recognition exactly, but something just adjacent to it. "She looks familiar," Karen said slowly. "Like someone I knew a long time ago." Danny's heart skipped a beat. "Do you know her name?" Karen shook her head. "No. I'm sorry." But her tone wasn't apologetic. It was haunted, as if her brain was catching signals her conscious mind hadn't tuned into yet. He ran through 4 more images. Nothing. Then he leaned back, masking his emotion behind a neutral expression. "That's all, thank you." Karen smiled politely, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Am I in trouble?" she asked, voice tight. Danny shook his head. "Not at all. Just keeping the house in order." He stood. She stood. They didn't shake hands. She left the room with the same quiet grace she always carried, the weight of invisible years pressed across her shoulders. Danny watched her go and didn't breathe again until the door clicked shut. He turned back to the monitor, rewound the footage of her face when she saw Claire's photo. Froze it on frame 14 minutes and 22 seconds. Her pupils dilated. Her throat bobbed once. And then, a flicker. Not recognition, not confusion, something deeper. Remembrance. Like the shadow of a memory surfacing from a place not meant to be accessed. That night, Karen couldn't sleep. Not because of the audit, but because something inside her wasn't settling. She tossed and turned on the thin mattress of her apartment, the sound of traffic below like a distant drumbeat. Aidan was asleep in the corner bed, thumb curled near his mouth, his breathing soft and slow. Karen stared at the ceiling, then at the faint line of light from the hallway leaking under her door. She dreamed of rain, of stone railings and a high balcony, of her hands gripping cold metal as wind howled around her. Someone stood behind her, a man in uniform, silver bars glinting at his collar. She turned to him and whispered, "Arcadia ends." He didn't flinch. He nodded. And then she kissed his cheek and disappeared into the dark. Karen woke gasping, heart pounding, the name Edenfall burned into the center of her brain like a brand. She sat up, chest heaving. Aidan stirred but didn't wake. Her hands were shaking, as if her body had held onto something too tightly for too long. "What the hell is happening to me?" she whispered. The room didn't answer, only the wind outside against the window, and the eerie knowledge that something inside her had just unlocked. She rose quietly and went to the kitchen, turned on the faucet just enough to hear water run. She stared at the drip. Edenfall. It meant nothing, but it felt like everything. She'd never heard the word before, but her blood responded to it like a key clicking into place. She poured water into a glass and turned on the TV, desperate for noise. A late-night news anchor rattled off military headlines, Pentagon audits, budget reallocations, troop reassignments. Karen barely listened, until one name cut through the fog. Admiral Danny Diggs. She turned up the volume. He was in the background of the footage, shaking hands, smiling. But she froze. Because she'd seen that man before. Not just during the audit. Not just in passing. But in dreams, holding her hand on that balcony. Whispering things she couldn't remember. Telling her to run. She turned the TV off. The room fell silent. Karen pressed her fingers to her temples. A sob almost escaped her throat, but she swallowed it. There were things inside her she wasn't supposed to know. Things someone had tried hard to make her forget. At the same time, Danny sat alone in his study with a single glass of whiskey and Claire's archived voice memo playing through an encrypted earpiece. "If they bury me, don't look," the recording said, static in the background. "Just trust me when I say I'm still with you, in ways they won't understand until it's too late." The file ended. Danny stared at nothing. The pieces were beginning to move, and he was no longer sure whether he'd started the game or just stumbled into it. He called up the Project Edenfall registry again. There it was, Subject K, implanted, born, protected, hidden, and, somewhere in that sequence, forgotten. But she wasn't forgotten now. She was mopping the floors of the world's most secure building. And she was remembering. Across town, Karen returned to her bedroom and knelt beside her son's bed. Aidan stirred and opened his eyes slowly. "Mama?" he asked. "I'm here, baby," she whispered. "Just checking on you." "You were crying," he said softly. "In your sleep." Karen stiffened. "How do you know that?" "Because I heard the man again," Aidan said, curling closer to her. "The man with the sad eyes. He said to protect you. He said to tell you not to be afraid when the rain comes." Karen kissed his forehead. "Go back to sleep, baby." But she didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, she stared out her window and watched clouds roll in. The kind that only ever brought thunder. What do you think Karen will discover next? And do you believe some memories are too dangerous to wake? Drop your thoughts or theories in the comments, especially if you've ever felt like you remembered something you never lived. The night stretched deep and cold inside the Pentagon, a maze of glass and steel where secrets slept lighter than men. Admiral Danny Diggs sat before 3 monitors in the classified analytics chamber, each glowing with fragments of data that shouldn't exist anymore. His eyes burned from sleeplessness, but he couldn't stop scrolling, couldn't look away. He'd followed Karen's name through 10 different systems, past 2 firewalls, and into a zone marked Black Vault. Authorization terminated. There, buried beneath 20 years of silence, he found it, the folder labeled Project Edenfall. He almost didn't open it. The name alone was enough to twist his gut. Edenfall had been the program whispered about in the war rooms, the one that blurred the line between saving lives and playing God. He remembered the pitch like it was yesterday. If memory could be preserved, command would never die. It had sounded like science fiction, a desperate wartime gamble in the early 2000s when enemy tactics were outpacing human endurance. But now, staring at the classified symbol on his screen, Danny realized it hadn't just been theoretical. They had done it. He entered his override code, one he hadn't used since the Afghanistan operations. The system hesitated, scanning for biometric confirmation, then unlocked with a muted tone. A dozen redacted reports blinked to life, most lines drowned in black ink, others half-corrupted by time. The first file header read, "Memory Transfer Viability Trials, Phase 1. Another beneath it, "Neurotissue Recovery, Whitestone Protocol." Danny froze when he saw the date. April 2003. 2 months after Claire's funeral. He opened the medical appendix, hands trembling. A simple statement filled the page, recovered neural tissue from subject CED, authorized by next of kin, Admiral Dr. Diggs. His breath caught. He had never authorized anything of the sort. He had signed a document buried under dozens of pages of grief-induced bureaucracy, believing it was a standard autopsy release. They had used it instead as permission to extract, to preserve, to repurpose. They had taken Claire's brain tissue and used it to rewrite the laws of mortality. Danny leaned back, running both hands over his face. He'd buried his wife once. Now he realized he'd only buried her body. Her mind, her essence, had been dissected and copied in the name of defense technology. He forced himself to keep reading. Objective: develop adaptive combat decision algorithm using human imprint. Secondary objective: assess cellular replication viability. And below that, another file, this one labeled Embryonic Imprint Initiative. His stomach dropped. The details were clinical, but the horror was not. 15 embryos had been created using mixed DNA sequences, human, synthetic, and Claire's recovered material. Only one survived gestation. Subject K, status, viable, female. Age acceleration stabilized. Cognitive imprint integration successful at 32% retention. Danny's throat tightened. That was Karen. Karen Townsend, born of Claire's tissue, built in silence, raised to exist as someone else. He stared at the line of text again until the words lost meaning. He scrolled through the rest of the logs, searching for context, for guilt he could name. A file labeled Authorization Chain caught his attention. 3 signatures appeared beneath it. The first, Dr. Naomi Renner, DARPA biogenetics lead. The second, Brigadier General Samuel Hightower, his former CO. The third, his own, Dr. Diggs. His fingers hovered above the screen, tracing the digital ink. He had given the final go-ahead 20 years ago, the same night he'd broken down in the corridor outside the morgue. For a long moment, he didn't move. The realization clawed its way up his spine. He wasn't just the man chasing the ghost. He was the man who'd created her. Karen wasn't a miracle. She was a consequence. He closed the report and opened the next file, needing to know everything, needing to feel the full weight of what he'd unleashed. The following pages described imprinting, a method of embedding neural echoes into developing minds. Subject K displayed recurring subconscious recall, storms, uniformed male, phrase, Arcadia ends. Possible residual emotional transfer from source memory CED. Danny's pulse stuttered. Arcadia ends, the phrase Karen had whispered in her dream. It wasn't a coincidence. It was programming. A ghost of a memory too stubborn to die. He stood and began pacing, the empty chamber echoing with each step. For years, he'd believed Claire's final words were lost with her. They never let you rest, do they? He'd whispered them to the ocean when they scattered her ashes, thinking it was the end. But what if those words had survived, embedded somewhere in a strand of DNA, pulsing quietly in another woman's brain? What if every time Karen said them, Claire's soul was reaching out from the dark, trying to finish the sentence she never got to? He turned back to the screen. The final Edenfall report was labeled Termination Directive. He opened it, half expecting another redacted void, but it wasn't empty. It was a single-page memo from Hightower himself. Subject K transferred to civilian custody under reclassification protocol. Genetic anomalies deemed stable. Monitoring ceased due to ethical and political exposure risk. In other words, they'd buried her, given her a fake name, a fabricated history, and let her disappear into the world until now. Danny's head dropped into his hands. The room spun with nausea and disbelief. He wanted to rage, to destroy every hard drive, every lab that had ever touched this project. But deep beneath the anger was something stranger, something quieter. Awe. Against every rule of nature, every betrayal of science and soul, a part of Claire had lived. And she'd found her way back to him without knowing why. He clicked through the directory again and noticed a smaller file hidden beneath the others, unlabeled but encrypted. It required 2 keys, one his, one belonging to the original project director. He hesitated for half a second before typing in his half of the code. The monitor flickered, then a new line of text appeared. Secondary sequence authorized. Subject A1 initiated. He froze. A1. He scrolled. Beneath it, faint text read, Derivative Protocol, Developmental Compatibility Study. Offspring Viability Achieved. Maternal Host, Subject K. It took him a moment to process. Then his breath stopped altogether. Aidan. Karen's son wasn't just human. He was engineered. A second-generation experiment, bred to test the stability of what they had created in her. He was Claire's descendant, or rather, Claire's continuation. Danny staggered back from the console as if burned. "Dear God," he whispered. "They made her a mother." A low alarm tone echoed through the room, not external, but internal, the system reminding him his clearance session was being logged. He forced his composure back into place, wiped the sweat from his palms, and started copying files onto a secure data drive. Every keystroke felt like a confession. If anyone caught him accessing this archive, his entire career, his life, would end before dawn. But if he didn't, Karen and Aidan would vanish again, this time for good. When the transfer bar reached 100%, Danny yanked the drive free and killed the terminal. The chamber went dark, leaving him with nothing but his reflection in the glass. He looked older than he remembered, lined, hollow-eyed, carrying too many ghosts in one uniform. Claire's ghost. Karen's shadow. Aidan's future. All 3 lived under his name now. He pocketed the drive and left the chamber, walking the deserted corridor where every fluorescent light hummed like judgment. As he reached the elevator, his phone buzzed, an encrypted text from an unknown sender. "We know what you found. Stop digging, Admiral." No signature. Just a timestamp. 2:07 a.m. The same minute the Edenfall folder had closed. He exhaled slowly, slipped the phone into his pocket, and stepped into the elevator. His reflection stared back at him from the metal doors. For the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man staring back. He had spent his whole career protecting the country from its enemies, but it turned out the enemy had always been inside. And he'd been part of it. The elevator opened to the lobby. Empty. Quiet. He crossed the marble floor like a ghost returning from its grave. Outside, the rain had begun cold, insistent, tapping against the glass like fingers from another life. Somewhere, he knew Karen might be awake too, staring at the same sky, hearing the same storm. Maybe, without knowing it, they were remembering together. He stood beneath the canopy, rain soaking the edges of his sleeves, the classified drive clutched tight in his hand. Lightning split the horizon, a jagged white scar across the sky. Danny whispered the name under his breath, just to taste the truth of it. Edenfall. The word didn't sound like science anymore. It sounded like fate. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, just after lunch. Karen was at work wiping down a hallway on sublevel 2 when her phone buzzed in her pocket, an unknown number from a local hospital. The voice on the line was calm but urgent. Your son, Aidan Townsend, suffered a fall during recess. He's awake and stable, but we'd like you to come in immediately for observation. The floor beneath her seemed to shift. Aidan, her entire reason for breathing, was hurt. She dropped the rag, ripped off her gloves, and ran. The janitor's exit badge beeped red, then green, as she pushed through the secured door and into the elevator. Her hands were trembling the whole ride down. She didn't stop to grab her things or notify a supervisor. Nothing else mattered now, only getting to her son. By the time she reached the hospital, her lungs ached and her chest was tight. She sprinted into the emergency room, brushing past patients and nurses until someone recognized her name and escorted her down the hall. Room 3C. She braced herself for the worst: blood, bandages, pain, but instead, she found Aidan sitting upright on a bed, sipping apple juice through a bendy straw. His arm was bandaged, but his eyes lit up the second he saw her. "Mama," he beamed, holding out his good arm. "I fell. But I'm okay." Karen crossed the room in 3 steps and hugged him so tightly that he squirmed. She kissed his forehead, trying not to cry, brushing back his curls. "What happened, baby?" she whispered. "I was running and I tripped. My arm made a bad sound." He looked down at the bandage and wrinkled his nose. "They did tests. It tickled." Karen turned to the nurse beside the bed, an older woman with wary eyes and an awkward smile. "He's okay?" she asked. "No concussion?" The nurse hesitated. "No signs of concussion. But the scans raised some questions. The doctor would like to speak with you in private." Karen's stomach dropped. "What kind of questions?" "Please," the nurse said softly this way. They led her to a consultation room just off the pediatric wing. Inside, a young doctor in blue scrubs stood by a glowing screen displaying Aidan's bone scan. "Miss Townsend," he began carefully, "your son's fracture healed itself in a matter of hours. Not days. Hours." Karen blinked, uncomprehending. "What?" "His cells, particularly in the musculoskeletal tissue, are regenerating rapidly. We've seen similar patterns in extreme rare cases of experimental therapy patients. But Aidan, he's 5. And he has no medical history of enhancement treatment." Karen stared at the screen, her mouth dry. "What does that mean?" The doctor looked troubled. "It means your son isn't just healing. He's evolving." That's when the hospital's internal alert pinged, and 3 men in plain clothes appeared near the nurse's station. Their suits were too crisp. Their eyes scanned too quickly. One of them flashed a Department of Defense ID and whispered something to the nurse at the front desk. Karen's maternal instincts flared red. Something was wrong. Deeply, irreversibly wrong. She returned to Aidan's room and found him still cheerful, swinging his feet off the side of the bed. "Mama, can we go now?" he asked. "I don't like this place." "In a minute, baby," she said, trying to steady her voice. She turned toward the hallway and caught the men watching her from just beyond the door frame. Not talking, just watching. Then one of them stepped into the room. "Miss Townsend, my name is Agent Cole," he said, flashing credentials that looked too clean to be real. "We're with the Department of Homeland Security. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your son's medical history." Karen's heart stuttered. "Why?" she asked flatly. "Because a flagged biometric signature just hit our internal tracker," he said. "And that's not something a 5-year-old should have." Karen reached for Aidan's hand. "We're leaving," she said. Agent Cole didn't move. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to insist." But before he could finish, another voice cut through the room like a knife. "Stand down, Cole." Admiral Diggs stepped into the room, sharp in uniform, eyes like thunder. "She's coming with me." Agent Cole hesitated, clearly startled. "Sir, this falls classified under Edenfall," Diggs snapped. "Effective immediately, she's under my jurisdiction." Karen looked between them, stunned. "Admiral." "Let's go," Diggs said, not looking at her. "Now." They walked out of the hospital together, Karen gripping Aidan tight in her arms. No one stopped them. Not after Diggs made a single call that sent every man in a suit scrambling. They didn't speak until they were inside a secured vehicle idling at the curb. Karen buckled Aidan into the seat and finally turned toward him. "You want to tell me what the hell is going on?" Diggs exhaled slowly. "Not here," he said. "We're going to see someone. He'll explain what I can't." "Who?" "A ghost," Diggs said. "One of the last people alive who worked on Edenfall." They drove north, out of DC, past the fences and noise and flags. 40 minutes later, they arrived at a cottage tucked into the woods, quiet, unremarkable, isolated. Diggs led them to the door and knocked once. It opened to reveal a man in his 70s with thick glasses and a limp. "Admiral," the man said dryly. "Thought I'd be dead before you showed up again." "Dr. Levy," Diggs nodded. "We need to talk." Levy's gaze shifted to Karen, then to Aidan. He paled. "You brought them." "You owe me answers," Diggs said. "And she deserves the truth." Inside, the cottage was cluttered but clean. Books lined every surface, and a dusty laptop sat on the table beside a half-finished chessboard. Levy poured tea as if this was just another academic visit. "Edenfall wasn't supposed to work," he began. "We took tissue from terminal operatives, memory tissue, mostly, and tried to imprint it onto genetically viable embryos." Karen sat stiffly, her hand over Aidan's. "Embryos." Levy nodded. 15. He looked her in the eye. "Only one survived gestation. Subject K." Karen swallowed. "You mean me?" "I mean what's inside you," he corrected. "Your life is real. But so are the echoes inside it. Emotions, patterns, instincts. Ghosts you didn't ask for but inherited anyway." Diggs spoke next. "Tell her about the child." Levy hesitated. Then, Subject A1. Created 2 years after K stabilized. A compatibility test to see if generational imprinting held across inherited genomes. Karen shook her head, heart pounding. "You're saying Aidan, he's not just your son," Levy said. "He's the first legacy model. Not born. Made. And he carries encryption signatures not even I understand." Karen looked at Aidan, sleeping in the chair, arms curled around his stuffed elephant. "He's a child," she whispered. "He's mine. And they're going to want him back," Levy said. "Now that his signatures lit up the grid." Diggs stood. "Then we disappear." Levy frowned. "They'll find you." "Let them try," Diggs said coldly. "But this time, I'm not burying anyone I love." Karen rose too, her voice trembling but fierce. "If anyone touches him, they won't," Diggs said. "Because this time, we fight back." Outside, the wind howled through the trees. And somewhere, buried deep in the military mainframe, a red light began to blink, marking Subject A1 as active. What would you do if your child turned out to be the key to a secret the government thought it had buried? Tell us in the comments, and if you're hooked, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what happens when Edenfall strikes back. The safe house was buried somewhere in the woods of Virginia, off a service road with no name and no signal. The cabin itself was small, quiet, lined with old logs and sealed windows, the kind of place built to vanish. Karen stood on the porch, staring out at the trees while Aidan slept on the couch inside, curled beneath a quilt. The stillness pressed in on her like fog. She could hear her own heartbeat and something else beneath it she couldn't quite name. The last few days had shattered everything she thought she knew. Aidan wasn't just her son. She wasn't just a woman. She'd felt it in her bones before the words ever found her lips. The whisper. The balcony. The phrase Arcadia ends. They weren't dreams anymore. They were memories clawing their way to the surface. Behind her, the screen door creaked open and Admiral Diggs stepped out, coffee in hand. He looked different here, not smaller, but less sharp, like the uniform had been peeled away and all that remained was a man trying to hold his history together. "Did you sleep?" he asked. Karen shook her head. "Not really." Diggs nodded, as if that was the only answer he'd expected. He sat beside her on the porch step, setting the mug down between them. "They're not dreams," she said suddenly. "They feel like places I've been, people I've touched. I know what the back of your neck looks like." Diggs froze. "Excuse me?" "You have a scar, just below the hairline," she continued, her voice distant. "From a blade. You got it in 1998 in Benghazi. You never told anyone. Not even her." She looked at him. "But I know." His breath caught in his throat. "Claire never told me how she knew about that scar," he said slowly. "She said it didn't matter. That some things don't need words to be remembered." Karen blinked, and for a moment her face shifted, not physically, but in the way memory changes posture. "I told you," she whispered. "Under the firelight. When we thought the world was ending." Her hand trembled as it reached for her own face. "How is this possible?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive. "There's something I want you to hear," he said. "Something no one else has ever heard. Not even Aidan." This file was buried under 4 layers of security. Claire left it for me the night she disappeared. Inside the cabin, he set up a small speaker and loaded the drive. Karen sat cross-legged on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees. Her entire body was tense, like she was bracing for a blow she couldn't see. The file clicked and a voice crackled through the speaker, soft, low, unmistakably her own. "Danny," the voice began, "if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone." Karen's breath hitched. The voice on the recording continued. "You won't understand what I agreed to. I didn't, either. They said it was preservation. That memories could be carried, copied, imprinted. But I didn't want to live forever. I just wanted you to know that if something, finds you later and says things only I would know, believe her. That's all. Believe her." The message ended. Static filled the silence. Karen didn't move. Her hands had gone cold. Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. Diggs sat beside her, not touching, not speaking, just there. After a long moment, Karen whispered, "That's me. I remember saying that." She blinked, and a wave of sensation rushed over her like a tide. Rain on her cheeks. Boots sinking in mud. His arms around her in a tent lit by a single candle. She'd told him to stop pretending to be made of stone. She'd kissed him after the gunfire. She had said, "You never rest, Danny. That's why I have to." Her voice cracked now as she repeated it aloud. "That's why I have to." Diggs looked at her like he was seeing something impossible. Not a copy. Not an echo. But her. "Claire," he whispered, afraid of the answer. Karen shook her head slowly. "No. Yes. I don't know what I am." Her hands gripped her knees tighter. "But those memories? They're mine. I can feel them. I can smell them. I remember watching you sleep, even when you thought you were keeping watch over me." Aidan stirred on the couch behind them, but didn't wake. The fire in the hearth crackled low, casting shadows across the wooden floor. Karen stood, unsteady, and walked to the window. "They took her from me," she said. "And they gave her back without asking if I wanted to be her." She turned. "I am Karen. I raised my son. I bled for every shift and scrubbed every floor. But I also loved you. Before I ever knew your name." Diggs rose and walked toward her, careful, reverent. "You don't have to be her," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "Then why does it hurt so much?" she asked. "Why do I remember missing you before I even met you?" He reached out, but didn't touch her. "Because love doesn't die with the body. And memory, it finds a way back." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "There's more," she said. "I know there is. I can feel it, like pages missing from a book I've already read. Then we'll find them, Diggs said. Together. She nodded once, swallowing the emotion. I just need time. You've got it. Later that night, after Aidan had fallen asleep again, Karen sat alone by the fireplace, staring into the flames. She heard Claire's voice again, not in the speaker, but in her own head. Soft. Certain. Arcadia ends when you stop running. And for the first time, Karen wondered if the running wasn't from the government or the past, but from herself. From who she had always been, long before she had a name. Outside, a single snowflake drifted past the window and melted on the glass. Winter was coming, but inside the cabin, for now, there was warmth. There was fire. And there was a woman remembering herself back to life. The evacuation drill came without warning, just before dawn, wrapped in layers of perfect bureaucracy. A Department of Defense alert pinged Danny Diggs's secure line. Threat level elevation confirmed. Non-combatants authorized for priority extraction. On the surface, it looked legitimate, the sort of protocol they ran when a federal facility was under elevated threat or when they needed to relocate personnel without questions. Diggs didn't buy it for a second. But he used it anyway. Karen stood near the bedroom window of the safe house, cradling a cup of black coffee she hadn't touched. "You're sure this is necessary?" she asked, eyes flicking to the road beyond the trees. "No," Danny admitted. "But it's the only way we can move without raising alarms. If this works, we're gone before they realize we've disappeared." She didn't like it. Not the secrecy. Not the feeling in her bones that something was off. But Aidan was her priority, always had been, always would be. So she nodded and turned toward her son, still asleep on the couch beneath a blanket of cartoon spaceships. "Get him ready," Diggs said softly. "We leave in 10. The SUV arrived in silence, black and unmarked, its windows tinted so deeply it looked like a moving shadow. The driver never got out. Just popped the locks with a single click and waited. Karen buckled Aidan into the back seat while Danny checked the perimeter, hand resting on the holster beneath his coat. Something about the air felt too still, like the calm that precedes a detonation. "Drive fast," Diggs said as they pulled away. "And don't stop." The vehicle sliced through backroads and bypass lanes, merging onto a restricted corridor that only government vehicles could use. The city still slept under a layer of gray fog, the streets quiet except for the occasional garbage truck or delivery van. As they neared the edge of the Pentagon's loading wing, Diggs checked his watch. 17 minutes, he said. "That's how long we've got before the window closes." Karen looked straight ahead. "Let's not waste it." They passed 2 guard booths, both manned by men Diggs didn't recognize. That was the first red flag. The second came when the driver, supposedly operating under pre-cleared GPS coordinates, turned left instead of right. "Stop the car," Diggs said instantly. The driver didn't respond. "Stop the damn car." Too late. They entered the lower garage, a cavernous concrete belly beneath the Pentagon rarely used anymore. The lights overhead flickered once. Then the SUV braked hard. Karen shielded Aidan instinctively as the doors unlocked. "Out," the driver said. His voice was cold. Mechanical. "Wrong." Diggs pulled his weapon and opened the passenger door, eyes scanning the shadows. Karen followed, clutching Aidan close. The space was quiet, too quiet, except for the echo of boots approaching from every direction. 10 men emerged from the dark. No uniforms. No insignias. Just black tactical gear, faces masked, weapons raised. "Admiral Diggs," one said. "You are relieved of command." Diggs kept his gun low, but ready. "By whose authority?" he asked. "Operation Edenfall has been reclassified," the man replied. "You've exceeded your jurisdiction." "I built this jurisdiction," Diggs snapped. "And you're not on any sanctioned list I've seen." The man cocked his head. "That's because sanctioning isn't required when cleanup is the objective." 2 more soldiers flanked Karen and Aidan, their weapons subtly tracking the child. "You don't want to do this," Diggs warned. "He's just a boy." "He's not just anything," the man replied. "He's property." Karen stepped forward, her body trembling with fury. "You try to touch him," she said, "and I swear you'll regret it." The leader didn't blink. We're not here to hurt anyone. Just to contain a breach. We're not a breach, she hissed. We're a family. No, the man said calmly. You're an experiment. One that went too far. Aidan whimpered, sensing the tension. Karen tightened her grip, shielding him with her body. Diggs's finger hovered near the trigger. But they were outgunned. Outnumbered. Out of time. Then Karen heard it, not outside, but inside. A voice from a dream. Her own, but older. Calmer. Certain. When they corner you, when there's nowhere else to run, remember the words. Phase null. Arcadia ends. Her lips parted before she knew what she was doing. Phase null, she whispered. Arcadia ends. The soldiers froze. One blinked rapidly, as if confused. Another staggered backward, gun lowered, mouth trembling. The leader's eyes widened beneath his mask. What did you say? He asked, voice cracking. Karen repeated it, louder this time. Phase null. Arcadia ends. Then it happened. Each operative dropped to one knee, convulsing briefly, like strings being cut from marionettes. Their weapons fell from limp hands. Eyes fluttered. Breathing hitched. And then silence. Diggs stepped forward cautiously. What the hell? It's a kill switch, Karen said, her voice shaking. I don't know how I know. But they were programmed to obey it. Like failsafes. Neurological compliance chips, Diggs whispered. Deep-level controls built into their brains. Embedded conditioning. The leader looked up slowly, sweat beading on his brow. You're not supposed to know that phrase, he rasped. Only one person ever wrote it. Claire Diggs, Karen said. Your wife. The man swallowed hard. Then you're not Karen Townsend. I'm both, she said. And I'm done being silent. The lights above flickered once. Then steadied. Diggs moved quickly, retrieving weapons, securing Aidan in his arms. Karen stood motionless for a moment, her pulse pounding in her ears. The phrase still echoed in her head, as though it had been etched there long before she ever had a name. Arcadia ends. That wasn't just a command. It was a promise. They left the loading bay in another vehicle, this one driven by Diggs himself. No escort. No surveillance. Just the road stretching out in front of them like a lifeline. Aidan slept in the back seat, his stuffed elephant tucked under his arm. Karen stared out the window, eyes glazed with adrenaline and something close to grief. Where do we go now? She asked quietly. Diggs didn't look away from the road. Someplace they haven't burned yet. And after that? After that, we make them pay. Karen closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. Her body buzzed with truth, painful, staggering, undeniable. Somewhere deep inside her, the pieces had aligned. She wasn't just a construct. She wasn't just a mother. She was Claire. Not entirely. Not perfectly. But enough. Enough to fight. Enough to remember. Enough to end the thing that started this all. Behind them, the Pentagon's loading bay sat still and dark. Inside, the operatives remained on their knees, silent, dazed, defeated. Not by weapons. Not by force. But by a name. A phrase. A memory encoded so deeply it had outlived death itself. Karen didn't speak for the first hour after they left the Pentagon garage. The silence inside the car wasn't empty. It was loaded, dense, like the seconds after an explosion when your ears are still ringing. Aidan slept in the back seat, his head tilted toward the window, breathing softly like none of it had touched him. But Karen? She felt every second of it crawling under her skin, the whispers, the memories, the kill switch, the kneeling soldiers. The phrase Arcadia ends still throbbed in her skull like a heartbeat she couldn't silence. Danny Diggs drove without looking at her, hands tight on the wheel, jaw clenched hard enough to ache. He knew what she was going through, or at least what it might feel like, that moment when truth doesn't set you free, it unravels you. Karen stared out the window, her eyes unfocused. The trees blurred past, but in her mind, she saw 1,000 half-formed fragments flashing like old film reels, boots in the rain, firelight, passwords in blood, a ring on her finger, a whisper against a temple. I don't know who I am, she finally said, her voice almost inaudible. Danny didn't respond immediately. He knew the question wasn't for him. Not really. "You're not a copy," he said. "You're not a ghost. You're something new." Karen turned to him, her eyes rimmed red. "Then why do I feel like I'm grieving a life I only just started to remember?" The safe house they arrived at this time was deep in Pennsylvania, an old ranger station converted into a fallback shelter. It smelled of cedar and cold air, and Karen welcomed the distraction of making it livable again. Aidan helped unpack the supplies, giggling when he found canned peaches and a pack of playing cards. Karen forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something had broken loose inside her, and it wasn't done falling. That night, after Aidan fell asleep curled up under a quilt, Karen sat beside the fireplace without lighting it. Danny poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a chipped glass and handed it to her. "You said you'd tell me everything," she said softly. "So tell me." Danny sat across from her, elbows on his knees, glass untouched. "You know most of it now," he said. "But not what matters." "I met Claire in a war zone," he began. "She wasn't supposed to be there. She was a contractor, linguistics, embedded under DoD. But she carried herself like a soldier and looked at the world like it owed her something better." He smiled faintly. "I fell hard. She let me think it was my idea." Karen closed her eyes, listening. The words settled into her like they belonged there. "She died before her time," Danny said. "That's what I told myself." "But the truth?" "She signed up for Edenfall. Volunteered." Karen's eyes flew open. She knew. Danny nodded. She thought she could preserve something vital. Memory. Love. A record of who we were when the world started turning dark. "She didn't tell me at first," he continued. "I only found out after she was gone. They handed me a release form I didn't remember signing, a funeral I wasn't allowed to attend. Then years later, your name shows up on a cleaning roster. And you say the words only Claire ever said to me." Karen's voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't want to choose for you," Danny said. "I made that mistake once." Karen looked down at her hands. They didn't feel like hers anymore. Or maybe they never had. Maybe they'd always belonged to someone else, someone who loved too hard, who died too young, who whispered final truths into recording devices, and hoped her husband would remember. But the strangest part wasn't the confusion. It was how right it all felt. Like she'd finally come home to a house she never built, but had somehow always lived in. "I don't want this," Karen whispered. "Any of it." Danny nodded. "I know. I didn't ask to be her," she said. "I didn't ask to be a test, or a mother to an experiment, or some haunted miracle that they don't know how to categorize." Her voice rose. "I just wanted to survive." Danny reached across the table, palm open. "Then let's make that your choice. Not theirs. Not mine. Yours." Karen took his hand. It was warm, steady. She squeezed it hard, letting herself be held, just for a moment, just long enough to feel like the ground beneath her might stop shifting. But it didn't last. Because 300 miles away, in a concrete sub-basement lined with redacted files and silent screens, a red light blinked to life. A man in a suit sat in front of it, hands steepled under his chin. She activated the code, his assistant said. "Phase null." It worked. "Then we underestimated her," the man replied. "And Diggs. What do you want to do?" The man turned to the monitor. Karen's face stared back. "Wipe the board," he said. "No more containment. No more observation. Terminate her and the child." His assistant hesitated. "That goes against standing protocol. I am the protocol now," the man said coldly. "We let this run too long. Edenfall wasn't supposed to be lived. It was supposed to be used." He tapped the screen, freezing the image of Karen mid-motion. "Issue the kill order." The command echoed through encrypted channels, bouncing across satellites and ground stations. Within 2 hours, 4 assets were activated. Ex-military. No insignia. No mercy. All headed toward a single target. Back in the cabin, Karen jolted awake from a nightmare she couldn't remember. Her breath was shallow, her neck damp with sweat. In the dream, she'd been holding Aidan's hand as the world fell away beneath them, glass, sky, fire, and still she kept whispering the same words over and over. "Don't let them take him. Don't let them take him." She rose and moved to the window. The woods were still. The night was black. Danny found her there 20 minutes later, staring into the dark like she expected it to answer. "Something's coming," she said. "I can feel it." He didn't ask how. "Then we get ready," he said. Karen turned to him, voice iron. "No more running." "No," he agreed. "Not this time." They packed the essentials not because they were leaving, but because they might have to leave fast. Weapons were checked. Routes memorized. Aidan, sensing the tension, asked no questions. He just slipped his elephant into his backpack and clutched his mother's hand. As the sun broke over the trees, Karen stood on the porch, wind tugging her hair. Her mind was 1,000 things at once, memories returning in waves, an oath taken in the shadows, a child's laugh echoing in a sterile lab, a scar behind Danny's ear, blood on snow. But beneath the chaos was clarity. A single, steady truth. They had tried to erase her. They had tried to replicate her. But what they had done instead was awaken her. If your identity was built on someone else's sacrifice, would you protect it or dismantle it to build your own? Let us know what you would choose in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the kill order reaches Karen's door. The wind off the tarmac bit through Karen's jacket as they crossed the edge of the airfield. It was barely dawn, and the sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, just a pale bruise of light stretching above the tree line. Aidan clutched her hand tightly, his backpack bouncing against his side with each hurried step. Danny walked ahead, speaking quietly into a secure satellite phone, confirming the runway was clear and the flight path untraceable. Every part of this had been planned down to the fuel tanks, burner phones, and the pilot who wouldn't ask questions. This wasn't an escape. It was an erasure. A chance to shed every scar and name and number and start over somewhere cold, quiet, and anonymous. But as Karen stood at the edge of the hangar, watching the small plane glint silver under the fading stars, she couldn't move. Her feet refused. Her chest felt like it was full of sand. "Karen," Danny said, returning to her side. "We need to board. They'll be here in 20. She nodded, but didn't take a step. He studied her, then lowered his voice. "You're thinking of staying." "I'm tired of vanishing," she whispered. "Of disappearing every time someone decides I'm dangerous." Danny didn't argue. Not at first. He just looked past her, toward the woods on the other side of the airfield, as if seeing every memory that had led them here. "I gave Claire a dozen chances to run," he said. "But she stayed. Every time. Even when it cost her everything." Karen's eyes flicked to him. "And now I'm paying for that choice?" "No," he said. "You're being offered what she never had. A clean break. A way out." She turned away. "But what does that mean for who I am?" He didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Then Aidan tugged at her hand. She looked down. His face was calm, eyes big and brown and filled with something far older than 5 years should allow. "I had another dream," he said. "You were in it. Both of you." Karen crouched down. "What did we do?" "You were sad," Aidan said softly. "But only at first." She waited. Her throat was suddenly dry. "Then you stopped running," he continued. "You turned around. And you stood really tall. There was a light behind you. You were shining." He glanced at Danny, then back to her. "And he stopped being alone." Karen felt something inside her crack. Not break. Just split enough to let something new through. "You believe that?" she asked. Aidan nodded. "I know it. The man with the red eyes told me." Danny's head snapped up. "What?" Aidan pointed toward the trees. "He was watching us last night." Karen stiffened. "Who?" "I don't know," Aidan said. "But he wasn't mean. Just sad." He said, "Tell them the dream. Tell them they still have a choice." Silence fell over them like ash. Danny exhaled slowly. "They're tracking us. Could be residual psychic imprinting. Could be a backdoor signal in his code. Or," Karen said, standing tall, "it could be something else. Something we were never meant to forget." She looked at the plane again. It wasn't a rescue anymore. It was a surrender. "I'm not going," she said. Danny blinked. "Karen, I need to stop hiding," she said, voice steady. "I don't know what I am. But I know who I want to be. And that version of me doesn't run." Danny stared at her. For a moment, his jaw clenched like he might fight her. Then something in his expression softened. Then I'm not going either, he said. We stay together. No more shadows. Karen felt herself smile, small, raw, real. Aidan beamed and threw his arms around both of them. Told you, he whispered into her shoulder. Told you we weren't supposed to leave. Danny wrapped an arm around them both. All right, he said. We stay, but we don't just exist. We make a plan. The decision snapped through them like a live wire. Not fear. Not impulse. Clarity. The kind that doesn't need strategy yet, just resolve. Danny grabbed the burner phone and crushed it under his boot. We go dark. Right now. Karen nodded. What about the pilot? He'll wait. Or leave. Doesn't matter. Danny pointed toward the treeline. We disappear that way. Not into the sky, but into the ground. Where they won't think to look. They moved fast. Aidan on Karen's hip, gear on their backs. They vanished into the forest just as headlights crested the ridge on the far side of the airfield. 4 black SUVs. Unmarked. Unsanctioned. The kill order had arrived. Inside one of the vehicles, a man read the thermal scan and frowned. They're not here, he muttered. They made us, said the woman beside him. Again. He stared out the windshield. Then we flush them out. No more containment. Burn the whole grid if we have to. Back in the trees, Danny led them to an old ranger trail, overgrown, muddy, perfect. Karen kept Aidan close. The child never cried. Never questioned. Just watched. And Karen realized something. He wasn't just made. He was aware. Far more than anyone had expected. They camped that night in the skeleton of a collapsed fire tower, moonlight seeping through broken beams. Karen sat beside the fire, wrapping Aidan in a blanket. You really saw him, she asked. The man with the red eyes? Aidan nodded. He used to watch over you. I think he still does. Danny watched the flames. Maybe Claire left more than memory behind. Maybe, Karen said. Or maybe love doesn't die. It just finds new places to live. Danny looked at her then, not like a soldier or a survivor or a clone, but like someone who had come full circle. I don't want the old mission, he said. I want the new one. You. Him. This. Karen reached out and took his hand. Then we don't run anymore. We build. We take every broken piece they left us, and we make something that matters. In the dark, Aidan smiled in his sleep. The tickets were printed under new names, blank histories for a trio the world no longer recognized. Karen Townsend became Kay Walker. Aidan became Eli. Danny Diggs, once a high-ranking naval intelligence officer, was now a man named Frank Nolan. Their old lives didn't exist on these records. No scans, no files, no threats, only clean slates. The flight left from a private airfield on the outskirts of upstate New York. No gates. No questions. Just the low hum of a prop plane and the scent of diesel in the wind. The pilot was ex-agency, ex-contact, ex-complication, someone Danny trusted just enough to disappear with. They boarded with nothing but 2 bags and a child who asked if this new place would have pancakes. Karen squeezed his hand. It'll have everything we need. Danny sat beside the window, watching the forest shrink beneath them. He didn't relax until the clouds swallowed the ground. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding since the order went out. The kill command that should have found them in the woods never came. Somewhere between the airfield and the blackout, the mission to eliminate them had simply vanished. Buried, erased, or protected by someone still on the inside. Karen knew the change wasn't random. Not after everything. Danny had made a quiet call days earlier, using an ancient backchannel known to only 5 men alive. He never said who answered. But that night, the trackers blinked offline. The red flags disappeared. The system lost them not through evasion, but through permission. It wasn't an ending. It was an agreement. 3 months later, the sky over the Atlantic turned to silver as dawn painted a quiet coastal town in soft light. Arcadia, Maine. A place with too much wind and not enough tourists. Karen opened the cafe just before sunrise, flipping the chalkboard to open with a quiet sense of joy she hadn't known she could feel. It was called Arcadia's End. Not because she wanted to forget everything, but because this time she had chosen where the story landed. The inside was simple, wood paneling, handwritten menus, the smell of coffee and honey butter toast. Locals trickled in, curious, then loyal. Aidan went to school down the street and spent afternoons behind the counter drawing superheroes with whipped cream mustaches. Karen baked muffins she didn't follow recipes for. She didn't need them, she just knew. Sometimes, in the stillness between orders, the wind would shift and bring back sounds from another life. Helicopter blades. Rain on canvas. A man's voice whispering codes in the dark. But the memories didn't burn anymore. They settled. Like ghosts given permission to sleep. Danny didn't come right away. He sent postcards from places with no return addresses, sketches of trees, of stormy water, of old boots. He was quiet, watching from the edge, waiting for her to choose again, this time, without obligation. Then one morning, the bell over the cafe door rang, and there he stood. Hair longer. Beard grown. Not in uniform, but in a faded sweater and jeans. A man who no longer belonged to the system. Karen didn't say anything for a long time. She just poured him a cup of coffee, dark roast, no sugar, exactly how he used to like it. He took a sip, exhaled, and smiled. Still bitter as hell, he said. Still exactly right. She laughed then, a real, open laugh. Not sharp. Not guarded. It startled her. Danny's smile deepened. I miss that, he said. All of it. They sat by the window where the sun warmed the table, the sea glittered beyond the dunes, and Aidan chased seagulls barefoot in the sand. No sirens. No code names. No gunmetal tension under the skin. Just the thrum of waves and the rustle of newspaper pages and the clink of ceramic against ceramic. I haven't dreamed in years, Danny said quietly. Karen looked up. You're now. He nodded. Since I let go. Of what? The ghosts, he said. The war. The lies. The guilt. He looked at her. You let me rest. Karen reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. And you let me be, she whispered. Not Claire. Not a project. Just me. He looked down at their hands. You know what I never got to say to her? She tilted her head. What? He leaned in, just slightly. I'm still here, because of you. She blinked, and for a second the weight of all they'd survived pressed behind her eyes. But it didn't fall. It held, balanced by peace and the wild, defiant truth that they had chosen this. Not a new war, not a hidden cave, but a life. They stayed like that for hours, coffee growing cold, sunlight shifting. No one bothered them. Aidan came in eventually, cheeks flushed and hair windblown. You stayed, he said, hugging Danny without asking. Danny hugged him back tightly. Yeah, kid. I did. That night, Karen stood barefoot on the porch of her apartment above the cafe. Danny sat beside her, shoulders wrapped in a blanket, his eyes tracking the stars. Do you think they'll ever come? She asked. To finish what they started? Danny shook his head. No. The ones who wanted that, they've gone dark. They don't want the world knowing Edenfall worked. She thought about that for a moment. Maybe we should tell them anyway. He looked at her, curious. Why? Because, she said, it didn't make a weapon. It made us. And for once, Danny didn't have a strategic reply. He just smiled. Somewhere deep in a vault no one would ever access again, the final Edenfall file blinked into termination. Logged. Buried. Forgotten by systems designed to forget what they couldn't understand. And out here, in the quiet where no one needed code words, a woman who was once two people sat in the arms of a man who had once buried her. Not a ghost. Not a threat. Just a choice finally made. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.